I booked an Airbnb in a small town in Vermont for Christmas. It seemed like the perfect getaway, a chance to escape the city and enjoy a quiet holiday surrounded by snow-capped mountains. I found this charming-looking cabin online, all decked out with twinkling lights and evergreen garlands in the photos. The reviews were great and the host seemed friendly in our messages. I packed up my car with presents for my family, who were going to join me in a couple of days, and hit the road. The drive up was beautiful. As I wound through the mountains, the radio played Christmas carols and the scenery got more and more picturesque. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to set. The town was tiny, with just a main street lined with quaint shops all decorated for the holidays. I followed the directions to the cabin, which was set back a bit from the road. At first glance, it looked just like the photos, a cozy log cabin with a big porch and rocking chairs out front. There was a light dusting of snow on the ground and icicles hanging from the roof. I grabbed my suitcase and the bag of groceries I'd picked up in town and headed up to the front door. The check-in instructions said there'd be a lockbox with the key, and I found it easily enough. Inside, the cabin was rustic but comfortable. There was a big stone fireplace in the living room, and the kitchen had all the basics I'd need to cook Christmas dinner. I unpacked my things and put the groceries away, then settled in on the couch with a mug of hot chocolate. It felt so peaceful and festive, exactly the kind of Christmas I'd been hoping for. I spent Christmas Eve exploring the town a bit and doing some last-minute shopping. When I got back to the cabin that evening, I wrapped the presents I'd brought and arranged them under the small tree in the corner. I baked some cookies and left them out with a glass of milk, feeling a bit silly but enjoying the childhood tradition. Before bed, I called my family to confirm their travel plans for the next day. Everything was set for a perfect Christmas. I went to sleep feeling excited for the morning, like a little kid again. The last thing I remember is the soft glow of the tree lights as I drifted off. I woke up suddenly in the early hours of Christmas morning. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The cabin was dark and quiet, but as I became more alert, I realized something felt off. The air felt different somehow, colder with a draft that shouldn't have been there. I got out of bed and fumbled for the light switch. When the lights came on, I froze. The bedroom door was wide open, and beyond it I could see that something was very wrong in the living room. My heart started pounding as I cautiously made my way out of the bedroom. The living room was a disaster. Furniture was overturned, drawers pulled out and emptied. The Christmas tree was knocked over, ornaments shattered on the floor. And the presents, all the carefully wrapped gifts for my family, were gone. I stood there in shock for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Then I snapped into action, racing through the cabin to see the full extent of the damage. Every room had been ransacked. All my belongings were gone. Clothes, laptop, phone, wallet. Even the groceries had been cleaned out of the fridge and cabinets. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had broken in and robbed me while I was sleeping just feet away. I felt violated and terrified. How had I not heard anything? What if I had woken up while they were still here? I ran to the front door, which was still locked. But when I went to the back door, I found it standing open, letting in the frigid morning air. They must have picked the lock to get in. I needed to call the police, but my phone was gone. I threw on the clothes I'd been wearing the day before, the only things left, and ran outside. It was still dark, the sun not yet up on Christmas morning. I pounded on the door of the nearest neighbor, an older couple who fortunately were early risers. They let me use their phone to call the police, who arrived about 20 minutes later. As we waited, the couple made me some coffee and tried to calm me down. I was shaking, both from the cold and from shock. When the police arrived, I led them through the cabin, describing what had been taken. As they looked around and took notes, one of the officers started asking me questions about how I'd booked the rental. When I explained it was through Airbnb, his expression changed. That's when he told me the disturbing truth. The owner of this cabin was a known scammer. He didn't actually own the property, but had somehow gained access to it and had been renting it out illegally. And this wasn't the first time guests had been robbed. There had been at least 3 other incidents in the past year, all following the same pattern. The scammer would rent the cabin out for the holidays, then break in and steal everything while the guests were sleeping. I felt sick as the officer explained all this. How could I have been so naive? I'd handed over my credit card info, ID, everything to this criminal. And now not only were all my possessions gone, but my personal information was compromised too. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. Reescrevi o relato substituindo os diálogos e simulações de fala por descrições, conforme solicitado. I found this Airbnb in Pennsylvania for Christmas because I wanted to get away from the city and have a quiet holiday. It was a charming 2-story house in a small town, surrounded by woods. When I arrived, the place looked exactly like the pictures online, a cozy, rustic home with a wraparound porch and big windows. The owner had left the key under the mat, so I let myself in. The house was warm and inviting with a big fireplace in the living room and a fully equipped kitchen. I started unpacking my bags, putting my clothes in the dresser and my toiletries in the bathroom. Everything seemed perfect. For the first couple of days, I just relaxed and enjoyed the peace and quiet. I'd wake up late, make some coffee, and spend hours reading by the fireplace. In the afternoons, I'd go for walks in the woods behind the house. It was exactly the kind of break I needed. On the third day, I noticed something odd. When I came back from my walk, I could have sworn my coffee mug was in a different spot on the kitchen counter. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I'd just forgotten where I left it. But then I noticed a few other small things that seemed out of place. A book on the coffee table that I didn't remember moving. A throw pillow on the couch that was on the opposite side from where I usually sat. I started paying more attention to where I left things. I even took a photo of how I arranged my toiletries in the bathroom before I went out one day. When I came back, the arrangement was slightly different. Nothing major, just small shifts in position. But I knew I hadn't touched them. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the house was settling, causing things to move slightly. Or maybe I was just being paranoid. But the feeling that something was off just wouldn't go away. Then I noticed food disappearing from the fridge. At first, it was just small things. A yogurt here, an apple there. I thought maybe I'd eaten them and forgotten. But then half a lasagna I'd made disappeared overnight. I knew I hadn't eaten it. I started double-checking all the locks before I went to bed or left the house. I even put a chair against my bedroom door at night. But every time I'd wake up or come back from a walk, something else would be slightly off. One day I came back from grocery shopping to find my clothes in the dresser had been rearranged. They were all still there, but in a different order. That's when I knew for sure someone was coming into the house when I wasn't there. I was terrified. I thought about leaving right then, but it was already dark out and the nearest town was miles away. I decided to stay one more night and leave first thing in the morning. That night I couldn't sleep. Every little creak and groan of the house made me jump. I lay in bed staring at the door, half expecting someone to burst in at any moment. In the morning, I started packing my bags as quietly as possible. That's when I heard it. Footsteps coming from downstairs. Slow, careful footsteps like someone trying not to be heard. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I looked around frantically for something to defend myself with, but there was nothing. The footsteps were getting closer, coming up the stairs. I pressed myself against the wall next to the door, hoping whoever it was would just pass by. But the footsteps stopped right outside my room. The doorknob started to turn slowly. In a panic, I shoved all my weight against the door, slamming it shut. There was a surprised yelp from the other side. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage it. I shouted, pretending I had called the police. After a moment of silence, a man's voice responded from the other side of the door. He claimed to be the owner and apologized for scaring me. Confused and terrified, I questioned his presence, as this was supposed to be a whole house rental. He explained that he had been living in the basement, which I hadn't even realized existed. He admitted to being there the entire time, saying he couldn't afford to leave the house empty and needed the rental income. I was in disbelief as I realized this man had been living in the house, sneaking around when I was out and going through my things. I confronted him about touching my belongings and eating my food. He apologized again, saying he got curious and sometimes hungry. Feeling sick to my stomach, I demanded to leave immediately. He agreed to stay in the basement until I was gone. I packed my bags as quickly as possible, constantly looking over my shoulder. I left the key on the kitchen counter and rushed to my car. As I was pulling out of the driveway, I saw movement at one of the basement windows, a face peering out, watching me leave. I sped away as fast as I could, not looking back. I drove straight to the nearest police station to report what had happened. The officers took my statement, looking increasingly concerned as I told my story. They said they'd investigate immediately. Later, I found out that the man wasn't the real owner at all. He was a squatter who had been living in the abandoned house for months, posing as the owner online and pocketing the rental fees. The real owner had no idea any of this was happening. I decided to rent a cabin in Maine for Christmas. I wanted some time alone, away from the city and all the holiday chaos. Found this cozy-looking place on Airbnb, tucked away in the woods near a small town. It seemed perfect, quiet, isolated, with good reviews from previous guests. The drive up was beautiful, snow-covered trees, winding roads, that kind of thing. I arrived in the afternoon, just as it was starting to get dark. The cabin looked just like the photos, all wooden with a big porch and these huge windows. The owner had left the key under a flower pot, so I let myself in. Inside, it was even nicer than I expected. There was a big stone fireplace in the living room, a fully equipped kitchen, and this really comfortable-looking bed in the bedroom. I started unpacking, putting my clothes in the dresser, my toiletries in the bathroom. I brought some groceries with me, so I stocked up the fridge too. That first evening, I just relaxed, made myself some dinner, got a fire going in the fireplace and settled in with a book. It felt so peaceful, exactly what I needed. I went to bed early, feeling really good about my decision to come here. The next few days were great. I'd wake up late, make some coffee, and spend the morning reading or watching the snow fall outside. In the afternoons, I'd go for walks in the woods. There were these great hiking trails nearby. In the evenings, I'd cook dinner and maybe watch a movie on my laptop. It was simple, but it felt luxurious to have all this time to myself. On Christmas Eve, I decided to treat myself. I made a big dinner, roasted a chicken, made some mashed potatoes, the works. I even bought a little Christmas tree from a shop in town and set it up in the corner of the living room. It wasn't much, but it made the place feel festive. That night, I stayed up late, just enjoying the quiet and the twinkling lights on the tree. I remember thinking how nice it was to have this peaceful Christmas, away from all the usual stress and obligations. When I finally went to bed, I was feeling really content. Christmas morning, I woke up early. I made myself a cup of coffee and was just sitting on the couch, enjoying the quiet morning. That's when I noticed something odd. There was this little red light blinking from behind one of the decorations on the mantel. At first, I thought maybe it was part of the Christmas lights, but I hadn't put any up there. I got up to take a closer look. It took me a minute to realize what I was seeing. It was a tiny camera, hidden inside a decorative snow globe. My first thought was that I must be mistaken. But as I looked closer, there was no doubt. It was definitely a camera, and it was definitely on. I started looking around the room, really looking this time. And that's when I found another one hidden in the corner near the ceiling, disguised as part of a smoke detector. My heart was pounding as I realized what this meant. Someone had been watching me. For how long? The entire time I'd been here? I went into the kitchen and found another camera hidden in the coffee maker. In the bedroom, there was one in the alarm clock by the bed. But the worst was in the bathroom. I found two in there, one hidden in the light fixture and another in the mirror. I felt sick. All those days I'd spent here, thinking I was alone, relaxing, everything I'd done, it had all been watched, recorded. I couldn't stop thinking about all the private moments, all the times I'd been undressed in the shower. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront the owner, call the police, I was scared and angry and felt so violated. In the end, I just knew I had to get out of there. I started throwing my things into my suitcase, not even bothering to fold anything. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched even though I knew where the cameras were now. As I was packing, I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a locked door in the hallway that I'd assumed was a closet, but now I was wondering, what if there was someone in there, watching the feeds from all these cameras? The thought made me pack even faster. I did one last sweep of the cabin looking for anything I might have missed. I found my phone charger in the kitchen, and as I unplugged it, I noticed something. The outlet looked slightly off. I pried it open with a knife, and sure enough, there was another camera inside. That was it. I grabbed my bags and practically ran to my car. I threw everything in the trunk and got the hell out of there. As I was driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone chasing after me. Once I was on the main road, I pulled over and called Airbnb. I told them everything, my voice shaking as I explained about the cameras. They said they'd investigate immediately and advised me to contact the local police. So that's what I did. I drove straight to the police station in the nearest town. I must have looked a mess, still in my pajamas, wild-eyed and scared. But the officers took me seriously. They took my statement and said they'd send someone to the cabin right away. I sat in the police station for hours, answering questions, showing them photos I'd taken of some of the hidden cameras. They asked me if I wanted to press charges. Of course I did. The idea that someone had been watching me, violating my privacy like that, I wanted them caught. We decided to book an Airbnb in Florida for Christmas. My wife and I were tired of the cold winters up north, so we thought it'd be nice to spend the holidays somewhere warm. We found this place online that looked pretty good. A small house with a pool in the backyard, not too far from the beach. The price was right, and the reviews seemed okay, so we went for it. We arrived in Florida late in the afternoon. As we drove through the neighborhood to get to our Airbnb, something felt off. The streets were empty, which was weird for a residential area. There were a lot of boarded-up windows and graffiti on the walls. I noticed my wife getting tense beside me, but we tried to stay positive. Maybe it was just this particular street, we thought. When we pulled up to the house, it looked decent enough from the outside. A bit run down, but nothing too bad. We grabbed our bags and went inside. The interior was better than the exterior, clean with new-looking furniture. We started to relax a bit, thinking maybe we had just seen the worst part of the neighborhood on our way in. We unpacked and decided to check out the backyard. The pool was smaller than it looked in the photos, and the water was a bit cloudy, but it was still nice to have. As we stood there, we heard a loud argument from the house next door. There was a lot of shouting and what sounded like things being thrown. We quickly went back inside and locked the door. That evening, we thought about going out to get some dinner, but we felt uneasy about leaving the house. We ended up ordering pizza delivery instead. When the delivery guy showed up, he seemed really nervous. He kept looking over his shoulder and practically ran back to his car after handing us the pizza. That's when it really hit us that something wasn't right about this area. We ate our pizza in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. Every now and then, we'd hear a car with a really loud engine drive by, or shouting from the street. It was getting dark outside, and neither of us wanted to look out the windows. Around 9 p.m., we heard what sounded like firecrackers going off nearby. At least that's what we told ourselves it was. Deep down, we both knew it was probably gunshots. We turned the TV on loud to drown out the noise and tried to distract ourselves. Just before midnight, it happened. We were in bed, both still wide awake, when we heard a car speeding down the street. Suddenly, there was a burst of gunfire, so close it sounded like it was right outside our window. We both ducked down instinctively, our hearts pounding. The car sped off, tires screeching. For a few minutes, we just lay there frozen. Then we heard screaming from outside. My wife was shaking, and I wasn't much better. We crawled to the window and peeked out. There was a person lying on the sidewalk across the street, not moving. Other people were running towards them. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial. When I finally got through, the operator sounded almost bored, like this was a regular occurrence. They said they'd send someone, but it didn't sound like they were in any hurry. We stayed by the window, watching. It took almost 20 minutes for the police to show up. By then, the street was full of people. Some were trying to help the person on the ground, others were just standing around talking. The police pushed everyone back and started putting up yellow tape. Neither of us slept that night. We just sat in the living room, lights off, watching out the window. Every sound made us jump. We talked about leaving, just packing up and driving to a hotel, but we were too scared to go outside. The next morning, the street looked almost normal. The police tape was gone, and people were going about their day like nothing had happened. But now we knew better. We could see the signs we'd missed before, the furtive glances, the way people hurried from their cars to their houses, the groups of tough-looking guys hanging out on street corners. We spent that day inside, debating what to do. We thought about contacting the Airbnb host or the company itself, but we were afraid of drawing attention to ourselves. What if the host was connected to the gang somehow? We didn't want to risk it. We kept the curtains closed and the TV on low, just loud enough to hear if there was any news about what had happened. But there was nothing, not even a mention of a shooting. It was like it never happened. As night fell, the streets got quiet again. Too quiet. We heard occasional bursts of laughter or shouting, the roar of souped-up engines. But mostly, it was just eerie silence. We barely slept, taking turns to keep watch. The next day was Christmas Eve. It felt surreal to realize that. We'd planned to go to the beach, maybe find a nice restaurant for dinner. Instead, we were huddled in this house, afraid to go outside. We had some snacks we'd brought for the trip, so we nibbled on those. Neither of us had much appetite. We tried to call our families to wish them Merry Christmas, but the cell signal was spotty. We'd get through for a few seconds, then the call would drop. After a while, we gave up. We didn't want to worry them anyway. What could they do from hundreds of miles away? That night, we heard more gunshots. Not as close as before, but still too close for comfort. And sirens. Lots of sirens. We turned the TV up loud and tried to pretend we were anywhere else. Christmas Day was the worst. We woke up to the sound of someone pounding on a door nearby, shouting threats. A car alarm went off and blared for hours before someone finally shut it off. We saw people in the street exchanging what were obviously drugs for money, right out in the open. We were running out of food, and the water from the tap tasted funny, so we were getting low on drinking water too. We knew we needed to leave, but every time we thought about going out to the car, we'd hear something that scared us back inside. Finally, on the day after Christmas, we couldn't take it anymore. We waited until first light, then threw everything into our suitcases as quickly as we could. We didn't even bother to clean up or strip the beds. We just wanted out. We opened the front door as quietly as possible and looked around. The street was empty. We rushed to our car, throwing our bags in the back. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. Just as I got the car started, we saw a group of guys turn the corner onto our street. They looked at us, started walking our way. I threw the car into reverse and peeled out of the driveway so fast I nearly hit the mailbox. As we sped away, I saw the guys in the rearview mirror, watching us go. We didn't slow down until we were on the highway heading out of town. I came to New York for Christmas thinking it would be magical. I'd always wanted to see the city during the holidays. The big tree at Rockefeller Center, the window displays on Fifth Avenue, all of it. So I booked this Airbnb in Manhattan for a week, figuring it would be cheaper than a hotel and give me a more authentic New York experience. The apartment was in an old brownstone, up on the 3rd floor. When I first got there, I was pretty excited. It was small, sure, but it had this great view of the street below. I could see people rushing by, hear the sounds of the city. It felt like I was really there, you know? For the first few days, everything was great. I'd wake up early, grab a coffee and a bagel from the deli on the corner, then head out to explore. I saw all the big tourist spots: Times Square, Central Park, the Empire State Building. It was cold, but I didn't mind. The city felt alive in a way I'd never experienced before. I even made friends with the guy who ran the deli. He'd always ask me what I'd seen that day, give me tips on places to check out. It made me feel less like a tourist and more like I belonged, even if just for a little while. On Christmas Eve, I decided to do one last big exploration before settling in for Christmas Day. I wanted to see the city all lit up at night. I walked for hours, just taking it all in. The streets were crowded with last-minute shoppers and tourists like me. Everyone seemed in a hurry, but there was this excitement in the air. I ended up at Rockefeller Center staring up at that massive Christmas tree. It was even more impressive in person than I'd imagined. I stood there for a long time just watching the lights twinkle and the ice skaters glide by. It was getting late and I was tired from all the walking. I decided to head back to the apartment. I was looking forward to a quiet Christmas Eve, maybe watching some movies and ordering in some food. When I got back to the brownstone, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The street looked the same, the building looked the same. But as I climbed the stairs to the third floor, I noticed the hallway seemed different. Cleaner, maybe? I wasn't sure. Then I got to the apartment door and my heart sank. The lock was different. Not just a little different, but completely changed. I stood there for a moment, key in hand, trying to process what I was seeing. I tried the key anyway, hoping I was just confused, but it didn't fit. I knocked on the door thinking maybe the host had changed the locks for some reason and forgotten to tell me. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, still nothing. I was starting to panic a little. All my stuff was in there, my clothes, my laptop, my passport. I pulled out my phone and called the host. It rang a few times, then went to voicemail. I left a message trying to keep my voice calm, explaining the situation and asking him to call me back as soon as possible. While I waited for a call back, I tried the key again. I jiggled the doorknob, pushed against the door. Nothing worked. I was locked out, plain and simple. I sat down on the stairs trying to figure out what to do next. About 10 minutes later, my phone rang. It was the host. I answered, relieved, thinking we'd clear this up quickly. But as soon as I started explaining the situation, he cut me off. He told me my booking had ended that morning, that I was supposed to be out already. I was confused. I tried to tell him that my reservation was through the 26th, that I had the confirmation email to prove it. He wouldn't listen. He kept insisting that I had overstayed, that he had new guests coming in. I asked him about my stuff and he said he'd had it removed and put in storage. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told him I had proof of my reservation dates, that this was a mistake. He just repeated that I needed to leave or he'd call the police. I hung up, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. I tried calling Airbnb's customer support, but all I got was an automated message saying they had limited staff due to the holiday and to leave a message. I left a frantic voicemail explaining the situation. I sat on those stairs for what felt like hours, calling and texting the host, trying to get through to Airbnb, even knocking on the neighbors' doors to see if anyone could help. No one answered. I was alone in a strange city, locked out of the place I was supposed to be staying with no access to my belongings. As it got later, I realized I needed to find somewhere to go. It was Christmas Eve, and the temperature was dropping. I couldn't stay in the hallway all night. I walked the streets for a while, looking for a hotel with vacancies, but everything was either full or way out of my price range. Finally, I spotted a 24-hour diner. The sign in the window advertised free refills on coffee. It wasn't ideal, but it was warm and open. I went inside. The diner was nearly empty. There was a tired-looking waitress behind the counter and a couple of other customers scattered around. I took a booth near the back, ordered a coffee, and settled in. I spread out my phone, my charger, and the few things I had in my pockets on the table. This was my command center now. I spent the next few hours alternating between trying to reach Airbnb, messaging the host, and searching online for some kind of solution. I found some legal websites that said what the host did was illegal, that he couldn't just change the locks and remove my stuff. But knowing that didn't help me right then. As the night wore on, the diner started to fill up. It was a strange mix of people, some drunk and rowdy, coming from Christmas Eve parties, others quiet and alone like me. I wondered what their stories were, why they were in a diner on Christmas Eve instead of at home with family. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to the waitress gently shaking my shoulder. She looked concerned and asked if I was okay. I gave her a brief rundown of what had happened. She was sympathetic but couldn't offer much help. She did bring me a free slice of pie, though. It was a small kindness that nearly made me cry. As dawn broke, I was still no closer to a solution. My phone was blowing up with messages from family and friends wishing me a Merry Christmas. I didn't have the heart to respond and tell them what was happening. I just kept calling Airbnb, hoping that someone would finally pick up. We decided to book an Airbnb in Texas for Christmas. My partner and I wanted to get away from the cold up north, and we thought it would be nice to spend the holidays somewhere warmer. We found this place online that looked perfect. A cozy little house with a big yard not too far from Austin. The photos showed a charming interior with a fireplace and a well-equipped kitchen. We were excited about the idea of cooking our Christmas dinner there. The drive to Texas was long but uneventful. We arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to set. The neighborhood seemed quiet, with well-kept lawns and holiday decorations on most houses. As we pulled up to the address, I noticed the lights were on inside. I figured the host must have left them on for us, which I thought was a nice touch. We grabbed our bags from the car and walked up to the front door. I rang the doorbell, expecting to find a lockbox with the key inside. Instead, the door opened and there was a man standing there. He looked surprised to see us, and for a moment I thought we must have gotten the wrong address. I explained that we had rented the Airbnb for the week. The man's expression changed from surprise to confusion. He said there must be some mistake because he lived there. My partner and I looked at each other, not sure what to think. I pulled out my phone to show him the reservation confirmation, thinking maybe he was a neighbor or a relative of the host who wasn't aware of the rental. The man glanced at my phone but didn't seem interested in what it said. He kept insisting that this was his house and that he hadn't rented it out to anyone. I could feel the excitement of our vacation starting to turn into anxiety. Something wasn't right here. Despite the awkward situation, the man invited us inside. We hesitated but decided to go in, thinking we could sort this out. The interior of the house matched the photos we'd seen online, but it was clear someone was living there. There were dirty dishes in the sink, clothes draped over chairs, and the TV was on. The man who we assumed was the host seemed agitated. He paced around the living room, muttering to himself. We tried to talk to him calmly, asking if he could call the Airbnb support line to clear things up. He ignored our suggestion and instead started talking about how he'd lived in this house for years, and no one could make him leave. At this point, alarm bells were going off in my head. I whispered to my partner that we should leave and find a hotel for the night. But as we turned to go, the man stepped between us and the door. He said we couldn't leave until we explained why we were trying to steal his house. My heart was pounding. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained again about the Airbnb booking. The man's eyes narrowed, and he accused us of being part of some conspiracy to take his property. His voice was getting louder, and I could see a vein pulsing in his forehead. We backed away slowly, trying to put some distance between us and him. I fumbled with my phone, trying to pull up the Airbnb app to contact support. The man saw what I was doing and lunged for my phone. I jerked back, nearly tripping over our suitcases. My partner managed to grab our bags and edge towards the door. The man was now shouting, waving his arms wildly. He picked up a vase from a nearby table, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to throw it at us. Instead, he smashed it on the floor, the crash making us both jump. I knew we needed to get out of there fast. I yelled at my partner to open the door, and we made a dash for it. The man was right behind us, still yelling about conspiracies and theft. We ran to our car, throwing our bags in the back seat. As I fumbled with the keys, I saw the man coming out of the house. He had something in his hand. It looked like a baseball bat. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. My partner was yelling at me to hurry. I finally got the car started and peeled out of the driveway. In the rearview mirror, I could see the man standing in the street, waving the bat and screaming. We drove for several blocks before I felt safe enough to slow down. We pulled into a gas station parking lot, both of us breathing heavily. My partner was on the phone with Airbnb support trying to explain what had happened. I was still in shock, my mind racing through the events of the last hour. The Airbnb representative seemed just as confused as we were. They confirmed that the booking was valid and that the host had good reviews. They couldn't understand why he was still in the house or why he was acting so aggressively. We decided we couldn't risk going back there. The support rep offered to help us find alternative accommodation, but at this point, we just wanted to feel safe. We drove to the nearest police station to report what had happened. The officers at the station listened to our story with concern. They took down all the details and said they would send a patrol car to check on the house. They advised us not to return to the property and to find a hotel for the night. We spent the next few hours in a daze, driving around looking for a hotel with vacancies. It was the night before Christmas Eve and most places were fully booked. We finally found a room at a motel on the outskirts of town. It was far from the cozy Christmas we had planned, but at least we felt safe. As we settled into the motel room, my phone buzzed with a message from Airbnb. They had managed to get in touch with the actual host. Apparently, the man we encountered was the host's brother, who had been staying at the house while the host was out of town. The host had forgotten to inform his brother about the booking. This explanation didn't make me feel any better. It didn't account for the man's erratic behavior or his violent threats. I couldn't shake the image of him coming at us with that bat. We spent a restless night in the motel, jumping at every sound. The next morning we received a call from the police. They had visited the house and spoken to the man. He had calmed down and confirmed the mix-up story, but the officers noted that he seemed unstable. They asked if we wanted to press charges, but we just wanted to put the whole thing behind us. We decided to cut our trip short and head home. As we drove out of Texas, I couldn't help but think about how differently things could have turned out if we hadn't managed to get out of that house when we did. I needed a break from everything, so I decided to rent an Airbnb in Washington State for Christmas. I wanted somewhere quiet, away from the city, where I could just relax and not think about work or family drama for a few days. I found this place online that looked perfect, a small cabin in the woods not too far from a small town, but far enough to feel secluded. When I arrived, it was already getting dark. The cabin was at the end of a long, winding driveway, surrounded by tall pine trees. It looked just like the pictures online, which was a relief. I've had experiences before where the place didn't match the photos at all. I grabbed my bags from the car and walked up to the front door. The key was in a lockbox, just like the host had said it would be. I punched in the code, and sure enough, the key was there. As I opened the door, I noticed how quiet it was. No traffic noise, no neighbors, just the sound of the wind in the trees. Inside, the cabin was cozy. It had that typical wood cabin smell, a mix of pine and old furniture. The living room had a big fireplace, and there was already some firewood stacked next to it. The kitchen was small but seemed well equipped. I put my groceries away in the fridge, thinking about the nice, quiet Christmas dinner I'd make for myself the next day. I took my bags to the bedroom. It was simple, just a queen-sized bed, a dresser, and a small closet. The window looked out into the woods and I could see the moon peeking through the trees. I unpacked a few things, then decided to explore the rest of the cabin. There was a small loft area upstairs with a TV and some books. The bathroom was clean with fluffy towels that looked brand new. Everything seemed perfect for a quiet getaway. I kept thinking how lucky I was to find this place, especially during the holidays when everything is usually booked up. As the evening went on, I made myself some dinner and settled in front of the fireplace with a book. The crackling of the fire and the absolute silence outside made me feel more relaxed than I had in months. I could feel the stress of the past year starting to melt away. When it got late, I decided to turn in. I wasn't used to going to bed so early, but something about the quiet and the darkness made me feel sleepy. I got ready for bed, double-checked that the front door was locked, and settled in under the warm comforter. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The room was pitch black, and for a moment I forgot where I was. Then I heard it, a creaking floorboard. I froze, listening intently. There it was again, closer this time. My mind started racing. Was it just the house settling? An animal outside? But deep down I knew it wasn't either of those things. The sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Footsteps. There was someone in the cabin. I lay there, barely breathing, straining my ears to track the sound. The footsteps were moving around downstairs, slow and careful. Then I heard them on the stairs. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever it was could hear it. The bedroom door was closed, but I hadn't locked it. I didn't even know if it had a lock. I watched the doorknob, waiting for it to turn. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. There was a long pause, and then, slowly, the door began to open. I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The door swung open, and a figure stood in the doorway. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out the silhouette of a man. He was tall and seemed to be looking right at me. Suddenly, the bedside lamp flicked on. The sudden light was blinding, and I squinted, trying to see the intruder. As my eyes adjusted, I saw a middle-aged man standing there, looking as shocked as I felt. He started talking rapidly, asking who I was and what I was doing in his house. I was confused and terrified. I managed to stammer out that I had rented the cabin through Airbnb. The man's face changed from shock to anger. He insisted that this was his house, that he lived here, and that he had never put it on Airbnb. My mind was reeling. I reached for my phone, pulling up the Airbnb booking. I showed it to him, my hand shaking. He looked at it, then back at me, his expression softening slightly from anger to confusion. He told me to get dressed and come downstairs. I was scared, but I didn't feel like I had much choice. I quickly pulled on my clothes while he waited outside the room. As I followed him downstairs, I noticed things I hadn't seen before. Family photos on the walls, mail on a side table, little signs that someone actually lived here. In the living room, the man picked up a stack of mail and showed it to me. His name and address were clearly printed on the envelopes. He explained that he had been away on a business trip and had just gotten back. He had no idea how his house ended up on Airbnb. As we talked, pieces started falling into place. The man, the real owner, had left his spare key with a neighbor while he was away. The neighbor's teenage son had found the key and decided to make some easy money by listing the empty house on Airbnb. I felt sick. Not only had I been scammed, but I had unknowingly been part of a crime. The owner was angry, but not at me. He was furious about the violation of his home and privacy. He called the police to report what had happened. While we waited for the police to arrive, I started gathering my things. I felt awful about the whole situation, and the owner's obvious distress made it even worse. He kept looking around his house, checking to see if anything was missing or out of place. When the police arrived, they took statements from both of us. They seemed as baffled by the situation as we were. They told me I might need to give another statement later as part of their investigation into the fraudulent listing. As I was preparing to leave, not sure where I would go in the middle of the night in an unfamiliar area, the owner surprised me. Despite everything, he offered to let me stay in his guest room for the night. He said he couldn't in good conscience send me out with nowhere to go on Christmas Eve. My family lives up north, and I just couldn't face another freezing holiday. I found this cute little Airbnb in a small town outside of Atlanta. It looked perfect, a cozy cottage with a fireplace and a big yard. The host had great reviews, and the price was reasonable, especially for the holidays. I arrived in Georgia the day before Christmas Eve. The drive from the airport was longer than I expected, and by the time I got to the cottage, it was already dark. The house was at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by big oak trees. It looked just like the pictures online, which was a relief. The host met me at the door. She was a friendly older woman who lived next door. She showed me around the cottage quickly, pointing out where everything was. The place was decorated for Christmas, with a small tree in the corner and lights around the windows. It felt homey, which was nice since I was spending the holidays alone. Before she left, the host mentioned that if I needed anything, her neighbor across the street could help. She said he was very trustworthy and had a spare key in case of emergencies. I thought it was a bit odd to give a neighbor a key, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I spent Christmas Eve exploring the town. It was small but charming, with lots of local shops and restaurants. Everyone seemed to be in the holiday spirit, and for a while, I forgot that I was spending Christmas alone in a strange place. When I got back to the cottage that evening, I noticed a car I hadn't seen before parked across the street. I assumed it belonged to the neighbor the host had mentioned. As I was unlocking the door, I saw a man come out of the house across the street. He waved at me, and I waved back, trying to be friendly. That night I stayed up late, watching Christmas movies and drinking hot chocolate. It wasn't the same as being with family, but it was peaceful. I finally went to bed around midnight, feeling pretty good about my decision to get away for the holidays. I woke up early on Christmas morning. The house was quiet, and for a moment I forgot where I was. Then I remembered. I was in Georgia, alone on Christmas. I got up and made some coffee, then decided to go for a walk to clear my head. As I opened the front door, I immediately knew something was wrong. My car wasn't in the driveway where I'd left it. At first, I thought I must be mistaken. Maybe I'd parked it on the street. But no. I clearly remembered pulling into the driveway when I arrived. I walked out to the street, looking up and down, thinking maybe I was just confused. But my car was nowhere in sight. That's when the panic started to set in. I ran back inside and grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 officers looking bored and slightly annoyed at having to work on Christmas morning. They asked me a bunch of questions. When did I last see the car? Did I give anyone else the keys? Did I hear anything during the night? I answered as best I could, still in shock. While one officer was taking my statement, the other went to talk to the neighbors. I saw him knocking on doors, including the house across the street where I'd seen the man the night before. After about an hour, the officers came back. They said none of the neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. But then they told me something that made my blood run cold. The house across the street where the trustworthy neighbor was supposed to live. It was empty. Had been for months, according to the other neighbors. I immediately tried to call the host, but there was no answer. The police tried too, but got the same result. That's when things started to get really weird. The officers asked to see inside the cottage, and as we walked through, they started pointing out things I hadn't noticed before. The Christmas decorations looked old and dusty up close. The food in the fridge had expiration dates from months ago, and when we went into the bedroom, they found something that made my stomach turn. A small camera hidden in the smoke detector. It turns out, the whole thing was a scam. The host didn't own the cottage at all. She had broken in months ago, set up fake listings on Airbnb, and was using it to lure in victims. The neighbor across the street was her partner. They had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to steal my car. The police told me this wasn't the first time this had happened. There had been a string of similar incidents in the area, all targeting tourists and holiday renters. They had been trying to catch the perpetrators for months. As I stood there in the fake rental, surrounded by police and crime scene techs, I couldn't believe how easily I had fallen for it all. The charming host, the cozy cottage, the friendly wave from the neighbor. It had all been part of an elaborate plan to rob me. The next few hours were a blur of police reports and phone calls. My car was entered into a national database of stolen vehicles. The police were hopeful they might find it, but not optimistic. They said these thieves were professionals, and the car was probably already on its way out of state. As the day wore on, more and more police and investigators showed up at the cottage. They were treating it like a major crime scene now, dusting for fingerprints and collecting evidence. I sat on the front porch watching it all happen, still trying to process everything. One of the detectives came to talk to me in the afternoon. He explained that they had been tracking this couple for months. They would rent houses that were for sale or in foreclosure, fix them up just enough to look lived in, and then use them for their scams. They had hit at least a dozen other places in the area. I decided to spend Christmas in Tennessee this year. Work had been crazy and I needed a break from the city. I found this Airbnb in a small town outside of Nashville. It looked perfect, a cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood, just what I needed to relax and recharge. When I arrived, the place seemed even better than the photos. It was part of a large house that had been converted into separate units. My apartment was on the ground floor with its own entrance. The host wasn't there to meet me, but they had left detailed instructions for self-check-in. The first day was exactly what I had hoped for. I slept in, then spent the afternoon exploring the town. It was one of those picturesque southern places, with a main street lined with little shops and cafes all decked out for Christmas. I picked up some groceries and headed back to the Airbnb, looking forward to a quiet evening. That night, I noticed a car pull up to the house. A couple got out and went into the unit next to mine. I didn't think much of it at the time. The walls seemed pretty thick and I couldn't hear anything from their side. The next day was Christmas Eve. I spent most of it reading and watching movies, just enjoying the peace and quiet. As evening came, I started hearing more cars arriving. The parking area in front of the house was filling up. I figured the neighbors must be having some friends over for Christmas Eve dinner. Around 9 p.m., that's when things started to change. The music started. At first, it wasn't too bad, just louder than I would have expected for a residential area. But over the next hour, the volume kept creeping up. Bass was thumping through the walls, and I could hear people shouting over the music. I tried to ignore it. I turned up the TV, put in earphones, but nothing could drown out the noise. By 11 p.m., it was clear this wasn't just a dinner party. It sounded like a full-blown rager was happening next door. I decided to contact the host. I sent a message through the Airbnb app, explaining the situation and asking if they could do something about the noise. No response. I tried calling the number they had provided for emergencies. It went straight to voicemail. Midnight came and went, and the party was only getting louder. I could hear glass breaking, people screaming, and what sounded like furniture being moved around. That's when I started to get worried. This wasn't just annoying anymore, it felt like things were getting out of control. I decided to try talking to the partiers directly. I put on some shoes and a jacket and walked out to the front of the house. The scene that greeted me was chaos. There were people spilling out onto the front lawn, red cups and beer bottles everywhere. The front door of the neighboring unit was wide open, with people going in and out. I tried to get someone's attention, to ask them to turn down the music. But as soon as I started talking, I knew it was a mistake. A group of guys near the door turned to look at me, and their expressions weren't friendly. One of them, a big guy with a shaved head, started walking towards me. He was shouting something, but I couldn't make out the words over the music. His body language was aggressive, though, and I didn't stick around to hear what he had to say. I turned and quickly went back to my unit, locking the door behind me. Now I was really scared. I tried calling the police, but the line was busy. It was Christmas Eve in a small town, and I guess they were dealing with other calls. I tried again and again, but couldn't get through. That's when I heard a loud bang on my door. Someone was trying to get in. I looked through the peephole and saw the same guy from before, along with a couple of others. They were shouting, demanding that I come out. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. The banging continued, getting louder and more insistent. I could hear the wood creaking, and I was terrified that the lock wouldn't hold. I ran to the bedroom and barricaded the door with a dresser. I could hear them in the main room now. They must have broken through the front door. There was the sound of things being thrown around, glass shattering. I was trapped in the bedroom, frantically trying to call 911 again. This time, I got through. I tried to explain the situation as quickly and clearly as I could, but I was so scared I could barely get the words out. The dispatcher assured me they were sending officers, but it felt like an eternity as I sat there, listening to the intruders ransacking the apartment. They were getting closer to the bedroom, and I could hear them trying the door. Just as I thought the bedroom door was about to give way, I heard new voices, authoritative, shouting commands. The police had arrived. The intruders' voices changed from aggressive to panicked. I could hear people running, doors slamming. I stayed in the bedroom until I heard a knock and a voice identifying themselves as police. When I opened the door, the scene in the apartment was devastating. Furniture overturned, my belongings strewn everywhere, the front door hanging off its hinges. The officers quickly explained that they had broken up the party and detained several people. They asked if I needed medical attention, which thankfully I didn't. As they were taking my statement, more police and paramedics arrived. I could see people being led away in handcuffs, others sitting on the curb being questioned. One of the officers told me that this wasn't the first complaint they'd had about parties at this address. Apparently, the owner had been renting out the units on Airbnb and to local college students, turning a blind eye to the wild parties that were becoming more and more frequent. As the night wore on, the chaos slowly subsided. The partiers were gone, either arrested or dispersed. The police finished taking statements and collecting evidence. An officer explained that they would be in touch for further questions and advised me to contact Airbnb about alternative accommodations. My family was scattered across the country, and I just couldn't face the hassle of traveling during the holidays. I found this cute Airbnb in a small town outside of Columbus in Ohio. It looked perfect, a cozy little house with a fireplace and a big yard. I thought it would be a nice, quiet place to relax and maybe do some writing. I arrived on December 23rd. The house was at the end of a quiet street surrounded by bare trees. It was cold and gray outside, but inside the house was warm and inviting. The host had left the porch light on and a key under the mat, just like they said they would. As I walked in, I was hit by the smell of cinnamon and pine. There was a small Christmas tree in the corner of the living room and a wreath on the mantel above the fireplace. It was more festive than I expected, which was a nice surprise. I started to think that maybe this solo Christmas wouldn't be so bad after all. I spent the next day exploring the town. It was one of those small Midwestern places where everyone seems to know each other. The main street was lined with little shops and cafes, all decked out for Christmas. I picked up some groceries and headed back to the Airbnb, looking forward to a quiet Christmas Eve. That evening I was sitting by the fire, reading a book and sipping some hot cocoa. It was snowing outside, and I was feeling pretty content with my decision to spend the holiday alone. Then I heard a car pull up outside. At first I didn't think much of it. I figured it was probably a neighbor or someone turning around in the driveway. But then I heard voices and footsteps on the porch. There was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the host hadn't mentioned that they'd be stopping by. I got up feeling a bit uneasy and went to the door. When I opened it, I was faced with a family of 4. A couple and 2 kids, all bundled up in winter coats and looking cold and tired. The man started talking immediately, asking if this was the Airbnb they had rented for Christmas. I was confused and told them that there must be some mistake because I had rented the house. The woman pulled out her phone and showed me their Airbnb confirmation. It was for this address, for these dates. I couldn't believe it. I went to get my own phone and pulled up my confirmation. We compared the two and they were identical. Same house, same dates. Somehow the host had double-booked the property. The family was getting agitated. They had driven for hours with 2 cranky kids, and now they had nowhere to stay on Christmas Eve. I was feeling pretty upset too. This was supposed to be my peaceful getaway, and now I had a house full of strangers. We both tried calling the host, but it went straight to voicemail every time. We left messages and sent texts through the Airbnb app, but got no response. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the house grew. The kids were whining, asking when they could unpack. The parents were arguing in hushed tones, clearly stressed about the situation. I was pacing back and forth, trying to figure out what to do. It was getting late, and the snow was coming down harder outside. After about an hour of failed attempts to reach the host, we realized we needed to make a decision. The family couldn't just leave. It was dark, snowing, and they had nowhere else to go. But I wasn't about to give up the house I had rented and paid for. We started looking for other accommodations in the area, but being Christmas Eve, everything was either closed or fully booked. The nearest available hotel was over an hour away, and with the snow, it wasn't a safe drive. The situation was getting more tense by the minute. The father was getting angry, saying he had paid for the house and had a right to stay there. I was trying to stay calm, but I was getting frustrated too. This was supposed to be my relaxing holiday, and now it was turning into a nightmare. We were at an impasse. Neither of us was willing to leave, but we couldn't all stay. The house only had 2 bedrooms, and there were 5 of us. Plus, none of us felt comfortable sharing the space with strangers. As we argued, we started to hear voices outside. The neighbors had noticed the commotion and were gathering on the street, curious about what was going on. One of them came up to the porch and asked if everything was okay. Suddenly, our private dispute became very public. The neighbor, an older woman, listened to our story and then offered to call the local sheriff. She said maybe they could help sort things out. While we waited for the sheriff, more neighbors started to show up. Some were offering advice, others were just there to watch the drama unfold. It was humiliating, standing there in the doorway with a family I didn't know, trying to explain this bizarre situation to a growing crowd of strangers. When the sheriff arrived, he looked as confused as we were. He checked both of our reservations and tried calling the host himself, with no luck. He said that legally he couldn't force either of us to leave since we both had valid reservations. The sheriff suggested we try to work out a compromise, at least for the night. He said if we couldn't, our only option would be to both leave and try to get refunds from Airbnb. Neither of us wanted to do that. After much debate and several more failed attempts to reach the host, we reluctantly agreed to share the house for the night. The family would take the 2 bedrooms and I would sleep on the couch in the living room. It was far from ideal, but it seemed like our only option. As we tried to settle in for the night, the atmosphere in the house was tense. The parents were whispering to each other, clearly unhappy with the arrangement. The kids were overtired and cranky, running around the house and touching all of my things. I felt like an intruder in the space I had rented for myself. I couldn't sleep that night. The couch was uncomfortable and every noise made me jump. I could hear the family moving around upstairs, the floorboards creaking. It felt surreal, lying there in the dark, sharing a house with strangers on Christmas Eve. Morning came, and with it, a new set of challenges. We had to figure out how to share the kitchen, the bathroom, the living spaces. The kids were excited for Christmas morning, but their parents looked stressed and exhausted. I felt like a ghost in my own vacation, trying to stay out of their way. We kept trying to reach the host throughout Christmas Day, but still got no response. The family's mood was deteriorating rapidly. They had planned a big Christmas dinner, but now they were stuck sharing a small kitchen with a stranger. The kids were disappointed that Santa hadn't been able to find them in this unfamiliar house. As the day wore on, the tension in the house became unbearable. The parents were constantly arguing, the kids were misbehaving, and I was at my wits' end. What was supposed to be a peaceful, solitary Christmas had turned into a claustrophobic nightmare. By evening, we were all at our breaking point. The father announced that they couldn't stay another night like this. Despite the continuing snowfall, they started packing up their car. I felt guilty, but also relieved. As they were loading up, the mother turned to me with tears in her eyes, asking how I could ruin their family Christmas like this. I decided to spend Christmas in Arizona this year. The winters back home in Michigan were getting to me, and I thought some desert sun would do me good. I found this Airbnb outside Phoenix, a little house that looked perfect for a quiet getaway. It was pretty remote, which I liked. I wanted to avoid the holiday crowds and just relax. When I arrived, the heat hit me like a wall. Even in December, it was way warmer than I was used to. The house was at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by cacti and scrubby desert plants. It looked just like the photos. A small adobe-style building with a flat roof and a covered porch. The host had left the key under a flower pot, just like they said they would. As I walked in, I was struck by how cool it was inside compared to the desert heat outside. The place was simple but nice. An open living area with a small kitchen, 1 bedroom, and a bathroom. There were big windows that looked out onto the desert landscape. I spent the first day settling in and exploring the property. There was a small patio out back with a fire pit, and I could see for miles across the desert. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely sort of way. I kept thinking how different it was from the snowy Christmases I was used to. That night, I sat out on the patio and watched the sunset. The sky turned all sorts of crazy colors, deep purples and oranges. It was so quiet out there. No traffic noise, no people, just the occasional sound of a coyote in the distance. I went to bed feeling pretty good about my decision to come here. The next morning is when things started to go wrong. I woke up early, planning to make some coffee and watch the sunrise. I went to the kitchen sink to fill the coffee pot, but when I turned on the faucet, nothing happened. No water came out. I tried the bathroom sink, same thing. Then I flushed the toilet and it didn't refill. At first I thought maybe there was some trick to it that I didn't know about. I looked under the sinks for shut-off valves, checked outside for a main water line, but couldn't find anything obvious. That's when I started to get worried. I tried calling the host, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message explaining the situation and asking for help. Then I sent a text and an email through the Airbnb app just to cover all my bases. I figured they'd get back to me pretty quickly. After all, no water is a big deal. While I waited for a response, I decided to look around the property more. The listing had mentioned something about the house being on well water, so I thought maybe I could find the well and see if there was an obvious problem. I walked around the house looking for anything that might be a well or a pump, but I couldn't find anything. As the morning wore on and the temperature started to rise, I began to realize how serious this could be. I was in the middle of the desert with no water. I had some bottled water I'd bought for hiking, but not nearly enough for an extended stay. And without running water, I couldn't shower, flush the toilet, or wash dishes. I kept trying to reach the host throughout the day, leaving more messages and sending more texts. I even tried finding a phone number for Airbnb customer service, but their system kept pushing me to use the app, which wasn't very helpful in this situation. By afternoon, I was getting really worried. The heat was intense, and I was already going through my bottled water faster than I'd planned. I decided to drive into town to buy more water and see if I could find someone who knew about well systems. The drive took longer than I expected. The town was small, just a gas station, a general store, and a few houses. I bought as much water as I could fit in my car and asked the cashier if he knew of anyone who could help with a well problem. He gave me a few names, but when I called them, nobody answered. It was 2 days before Christmas, and it seemed like everyone was either out of town or not working. When I got back to the house, there was still no word from the host. I was starting to feel really isolated and vulnerable. Here I was, in a strange place with no water and no help in sight. I started to wonder if I should just pack up and find a hotel in Phoenix, but the thought of trying to find a place to stay right before Christmas wasn't appealing either. That night was rough. I barely slept, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if the host never got back to me? What if I ran out of water? What if something happened and I needed help out here in the middle of nowhere? The next morning, I woke up determined to find a solution. I decided to check out the property more thoroughly. I walked further out from the house, looking for any sign of a well or water system. After about an hour of searching, I found something. A small pump house hidden behind some rocks about a quarter mile from the main house. Inside the pump house, I could see the equipment, but I had no idea what I was looking at or what might be wrong. There were some switches and gauges, but I was afraid to touch anything. I didn't want to make the problem worse or damage expensive equipment. Back at the house, I tried the host again. Still nothing. I was starting to get angry now. How could they just disappear like this? I decided to knock on some neighbors' doors. The nearest house was about half a mile away, and I could see a car in the driveway. When I explained the situation to the neighbor, an older man, he shook his head sympathetically. He told me that water was always an issue out here, especially in recent years with the drought. He said his own well had run dry last summer, and he'd had to drill deeper. The neighbor offered to come take a look at the pump house, which I gratefully accepted. When we got there, he examined the equipment and frowned. He said it looked like the well had run dry. The pump was running, but no water was coming up. He explained that this had been happening more and more in the area as the water table dropped. I asked him what I could do, and his answer wasn't encouraging. He said that the only real solution was to drill the well deeper, which was expensive and time-consuming. It wasn't something that could be done quickly or easily, especially not during the holidays. I felt completely lost. Here I was, in the middle of the desert, in a house with no water during Christmas. The host was unreachable, and the only solution was apparently a major construction project. I didn't know what to do. I went back to the house and started packing my things. I couldn't stay here like this. As I was throwing clothes into my suitcase, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Airbnb. They had finally responded to my complaints and were asking for more details about the situation. I quickly typed out everything that had happened: the lack of water, the unresponsive host, what the neighbor had told me about the well. I told them I was planning to leave and asked about getting a refund. While I waited for their response, I finished packing and cleaned up the house as best I could without water. I felt bad about leaving dirty dishes, but there wasn't much I could do. I wrote a note explaining the situation and left it on the kitchen counter, just in case the host showed up. As I was loading my car, another message came through from Airbnb. They apologized for the situation and said they would issue a full refund. They also offered to help me find alternative accommodation, but at that point, I just wanted to get back to civilization. We'd been looking forward to our family Christmas trip to Oregon for months. The Airbnb we booked looked perfect, a cozy cabin nestled in the mountains, promising a picturesque holiday getaway. As we drove up the winding road, the kids were buzzing with excitement, pointing out the snow-covered trees and the occasional deer. The cabin looked even better in person than in the photos. It was a charming 2-story log structure with a wraparound porch, decorated with twinkling lights for the season. We couldn't wait to get inside and start our vacation. As I unlocked the door, a gust of cold air rushed past us, carrying with it a faint, peculiar odor. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just the smell of a place that had been closed up for a while. We started unpacking and exploring our home for the next week. The interior was just as charming as the exterior, with rustic wooden furniture, a stone fireplace, and large windows offering stunning views of the surrounding forest. I noticed a few air fresheners scattered around, which seemed a bit odd, but I figured the host was just trying to make the place smell nice for guests. After getting settled, we decided to relax for the evening. We ordered pizza, played some board games, and planned our activities for the week ahead. Everything seemed perfect, but as the night wore on, I started to feel a bit off. It was subtle at first, just a slight headache and a feeling of fatigue. I blamed it on the long drive and the change in altitude. The next morning, things took a turn. My youngest woke up complaining of a stomachache and a headache. My wife mentioned feeling dizzy when she got out of bed. I still had my headache from the night before, and now I was feeling nauseous too. We thought maybe we'd caught a bug, but it seemed strange that it hit all of us at once. We tried to shake it off and stick to our plans. We had breakfast, although none of us had much appetite, and decided to take it easy for the day. As the hours passed, our symptoms got worse instead of better. My older kids started throwing up. My wife's dizziness became so severe she could barely walk, and I was having trouble concentrating on anything. By evening, we were all miserable. The kids were lethargic. My wife was having trouble breathing, and I felt like my head was in a vice. The smell I'd noticed when we arrived seemed stronger now, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was a musty, sweet odor that seemed to permeate everything. I decided to investigate. I started in the basement, figuring that's where a musty smell would likely originate. As soon as I opened the door, the odor hit me like a wall. I flicked on the light, and what I saw made my stomach churn. The walls were covered in dark patches of what looked like mold. It was everywhere, creeping up the walls, spreading across the ceiling, even growing on some boxes stored down there. Alarmed, I began checking the rest of the house more thoroughly. Behind furniture, under sinks, in closets, I found signs of mold growth everywhere. Some areas looked like they had been painted over or covered with wallpaper, but the mold was still visible if you looked closely. As I was making these disturbing discoveries, my wife called out to me. Our youngest had started having trouble breathing and was becoming unresponsive. Panic set in as I realized we needed to get out of there immediately. I quickly Googled symptoms of mold exposure, and everything we were experiencing matched up. Headaches, nausea, dizziness, respiratory issues. We'd been breathing in toxic mold for days, and it was clearly taking a serious toll on our health. Getting everyone out of the house was a nightmare. We were all so sick that even simple tasks like packing our bags felt monumental. My wife could barely stand without support, and the kids were too weak to help much. I was fighting waves of nausea and dizziness as I tried to gather our belongings. The whole time I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. The host had to have known about this problem. The air fresheners, the obvious attempts to cover up the mold. It wasn't an accident. They had knowingly put our health at risk, all for the sake of a rental fee. As we were loading up the car, I noticed water stains on the exterior walls that I hadn't seen before. It was clear this was a long-standing issue that had been neglected and covered up rather than properly addressed. Getting everyone into the car was a struggle. The short walk from the cabin left us all gasping for breath. As I helped my family into the vehicle, I could see the fear and confusion in their eyes. This was supposed to be our dream vacation, and now we were fleeing like our lives depended on it. I took one last look at the cabin as we drove away. From the outside, it still looked like a picture-perfect holiday retreat. But now I knew the truth. Behind that charming facade lurked a serious health hazard that had ruined our Christmas and put our lives at risk. As we headed down the mountain, my mind was racing. How many other families had stayed here and gotten sick? How long had the host been renting out this dangerous property? The beautiful snowy landscape that had seemed so magical when we arrived now felt ominous and oppressive. Our symptoms didn't improve as we drove. If anything, they seemed to be getting worse. My youngest was slipping in and out of consciousness in the back seat, and my wife's breathing was becoming more labored. I was struggling to focus on the road, my vision blurring periodically. I knew we needed medical attention, but we were in a remote area. The nearest hospital was over an hour away, and in our condition, the drive felt endless. Every turn in the road made my stomach lurch, and I had to fight to keep the car steady. As we finally approached the town, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that we were close to getting help, but dread at how serious our condition might be. The effects of prolonged mold exposure can be severe, and we had been breathing it in for days. Pulling into the hospital parking lot, I realized this was not how any of us had imagined spending our Christmas. Instead of opening presents by a cozy fire, we were about to spend the holiday in the emergency room, all because someone had prioritized profit over people's safety. I helped my family out of the car, each step a struggle. As we made our way to the entrance, I couldn't help but think about all the plans we had made for this trip. The ski lessons we had booked, the Christmas markets we wanted to visit, the memories we were supposed to be making. All of it was shattered by the greed and negligence of our Airbnb host. The automatic doors of the emergency room slid open, and we stumbled in, a family that had arrived for a dream vacation now seeking urgent medical care. The stark fluorescent lights of the hospital were a far cry from the warm, twinkling lights of the cabin that had welcomed us just days ago. As we approached the reception desk, I tried to explain our situation, but the words came out slurred and disjointed. The last thing I remember is the concerned look on the nurse's face as she called for assistance, and then everything went black. Last Christmas, I decided to treat myself to a solo getaway in Alaska. I'd always wanted to experience a white Christmas, and the idea of spending it in a cozy cabin surrounded by pristine wilderness seemed perfect. I found this great Airbnb listing for a small cabin just outside Fairbanks. It looked rustic but comfortable, with stunning views of the surrounding forest and mountains. When I arrived at the cabin, I was blown away. The photos online didn't do it justice. It was nestled in a clearing, surrounded by tall pines dusted with snow. The cabin itself was a classic log structure, with a small porch and smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, it was warm and inviting, with a small kitchenette, a living area with a fireplace, and a loft bedroom. The host had even left a small Christmas tree in the corner. I spent the first couple of days just settling in and exploring the immediate area around the cabin. There were some well-marked trails nearby, and I took short walks to get familiar with the surroundings. The silence out there was incredible. Coming from the city, I wasn't used to such quiet. At night, I could hear the wind in the trees, and occasionally the distant howl of what I assumed were wolves. On Christmas Eve, I woke up early, excited about the day ahead. I had planned a longer hike on one of the trails the host had recommended. It was supposed to lead to a beautiful overlook of the valley. I packed a small backpack with water, some snacks, and my camera. The weather was perfect, crisp and clear, with a light dusting of snow on the ground. The hike was breathtaking. The trail wound through dense forest before opening up to reveal stunning vistas of snow-capped mountains. I took my time, stopping often to take photos and just soak in the scenery. It was so peaceful out there, I almost forgot it was Christmas Eve. As the afternoon wore on, I decided it was time to head back. I wanted to get to the cabin before it got dark, as I wasn't too keen on navigating the trail in the twilight. The walk back seemed quicker, as it often does when you're familiar with the route. I was about a quarter mile from the cabin when I first noticed something was off. There was an unusual smell in the air, musky and wild. Then I saw some disturbed snow and broken branches on the trail. At first I thought maybe another hiker had come through, but as I got closer to the cabin, a sense of unease started to grow. When the cabin came into view, I stopped dead in my tracks. The front door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Even from a distance, I could see splintered wood around the doorframe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Had there been a break-in? Was someone still inside? I approached cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was there. As I got closer, the extent of the damage became clear. It wasn't a person who had broken in. It was a bear. There were deep claw marks on the door and the porch railings. The windows were smashed, and I could see debris scattered all over the porch. My heart was pounding as I stepped onto the porch. The inside of the cabin was a disaster zone. Furniture was overturned. The contents of drawers and cabinets were strewn everywhere. The Christmas tree lay on its side, ornaments smashed on the floor. But what really hit me was the smell. A strong, wild odor that permeated everything. I stood in the doorway, unable to fully process what I was seeing. The cozy cabin I had left just hours ago was now a wreck. My suitcase had been ripped open, my clothes scattered and shredded. The food I had stored in the cupboards was gone, wrappers and packaging torn apart on the floor. Even the small Christmas gifts I had brought for myself were destroyed, wrapping paper and boxes mingling with the rest of the debris. As the initial shock wore off, fear set in. The bear could still be nearby. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin. It was no longer secure, and the smell of food might attract the bear back. But I was miles from the nearest town with no car. My phone had no signal out here, so calling for help wasn't an option. I quickly assessed my options. The sun was setting and temperatures would drop rapidly. I couldn't risk trying to hike out in the dark. My best bet was to spend the night in my rental car, which was parked about 50 yards from the cabin. I gingerly entered the cabin, keeping an eye out for any sign of the bear's return. I grabbed what I could, some intact clothes, my sleeping bag which had thankfully been in the car, and any food that was still sealed and uncontaminated. I also found a flashlight and some extra batteries. As I was gathering these items, I heard a noise outside that made me freeze. It was a low, grunting sound, followed by the snap of a branch. The bear was back. I moved as quietly as I could to the window and peered out. There it was, at the edge of the clearing, a massive brown bear, probably 700 pounds or more. It was sniffing the air, likely catching the scent of the food it had left behind in the cabin. I knew I had to make a run for the car. It was only 50 yards, but it felt like a mile with that bear out there. I waited, watching the bear's movements. It seemed preoccupied with something at the forest's edge. Taking a deep breath, I made my move. I burst out of the cabin, my arms full of my hastily gathered supplies, and ran for the car as fast as I could. I heard a startled sound from the bear, but I didn't look back. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly get the key in the lock. Just as I heard heavy footsteps behind me, I wrenched the door open and dove inside, slamming it shut. The bear circled the car a few times, standing up on its hind legs to peer in the windows. I sat there, hardly daring to breathe, as this enormous creature investigated the car. After what seemed like an eternity, it lumbered back towards the cabin. I spent that night in the car, too terrified to sleep. Every sound made me jump. The wind in the trees, the creaking of branches under the weight of snow. I kept the flashlight on, scanning the darkness around the car. Occasionally, I would see the bear's shape moving around the cabin or at the edge of the clearing. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped dramatically. My breath frosted on the inside of the car windows. I huddled in my sleeping bag, shivering not just from the cold, but from the fear of what was out there in the dark. I kept checking my phone, hoping for a signal, but there was nothing. I was completely cut off, spending Christmas Eve trapped in a car in the Alaskan wilderness, with a bear prowling outside. As the first light of Christmas morning began to appear, I finally allowed myself to relax a little. The bear had disappeared into the forest about an hour earlier. I was exhausted, cold, and hungry, but alive. With daylight, I could better assess the situation. The cabin was a complete loss. No way I could stay there. I knew I had to try to make it to the main road where I might be able to flag down help. I started the car, thankful that it had enough gas, and began slowly navigating down the narrow, snow-covered access road. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.